The spotlight was blinding, the laughter deafening. Jim Carrey stood center stage at a grand theater in Los Angeles, his face stretched into one of his signature exaggerated expressions. The audience erupted in applause, their faces bright with amusement. He had done it again, delivered another perfect punchline, another wave of euphoria to the sea of people who worshipped his humor. Yet, as he bowed and waved, his heart felt like an empty stage after the curtains closed. Backstage, the energy was different. Assistants bustled around, congratulating him, but their words felt like distant echoes. Jim forced a smile, nodding at the crew as he made his way to his dressing room. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, his face fell, his body slumping onto the couch, like a marionette with severed strings. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, the same rubbery face the world loved, the same eyes that had once sparkled with mischief. But now, those eyes held something else: exhaustion, loneliness. It wasn't the first time he had felt this way. Lately, the laughter had started to feel like a performance beyond the stage, an expectation he had to meet even when no cameras were rolling. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his agent. "Fantastic show! Booked you another late-night appearance next week. You're on top, Jim. Keep the energy up." Jim sighed, rubbing his temples. Keep the energy up. That was the problem. He had been keeping it up for decades, pushing himself to be the man everyone expected him to be. The comedian, the entertainer, the endless source of laughter. But what happened when the laughter stopped? A sharp knock on the door broke his thoughts. He sat up, composing himself before calling out, "Yeah?" The door opened slightly, and a young assistant peeked in. Mr. Carrey, the reporters are waiting for a few words. Should I let them in?" Jim hesitated, then forced a grin. "Of course. Send them in." Within moments, a small group of journalists entered, armed with notepads and recorders. The questions came rapid fire, the same ones he had answered 100 times before. "Jim, how do you keep your comedy so fresh? Where do you find the energy to always be so funny? You're a legend in comedy. What's your secret to staying on top?" Jim chuckled, giving them the charming, witty responses they expected. But then, one question cut through the rehearsed answers. "Jim, do you ever feel pressure to always be the funny guy, even when you don't feel like it?" For the first time that evening, he hesitated. The room seemed to shrink. His fingers tapped restlessly against his knee. He opened his mouth, then closed it, unsure of how to answer. He started, then forced a laugh. "Well, I suppose the world doesn't pay to see a sad clown, does it?" The reporters chuckled, jotting down their notes, unaware of the truth hidden beneath his joke. But Jim knew. The world didn't want to see his sadness. They only wanted the laughter. The interview wrapped up, and Jim quickly excused himself. He needed air. Grabbing his coat, he slipped out the back door of the theater and into the cold night. The city hummed around him, horns honking, people laughing, life moving at its relentless pace. He walked aimlessly, hands deep in his pockets, head down, lost in thought. Then, without thinking, he found himself in front of a small comedy club. A sign above the door read, "Open Mic Night, New Faces of Comedy." He lingered outside, watching young comedians nervously prepare their sets. They had that fire, that hunger in their eyes, the same one he had when he started. But somewhere along the way, he had lost that fire, replaced it with an act so polished it no longer felt real. A young comedian stepped outside for a breath of air, spotting Jim in the dim streetlight. His eyes widened in disbelief. "No way. You're Jim Carrey." Jim smiled, offering a small nod. "Guilty." The kid laughed. "Man, you're the reason I got into comedy. I used to watch your movies on repeat. You make it look so effortless. How do you do it?" Jim studied him for a moment before answering, his voice softer than usual. "You just pretend long enough until you forget you're pretending." The young comic frowned slightly. "That sounds kind of sad." Jim chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, I guess it does." Before the conversation could continue, a voice called from inside the club. "You're up next, Jake." The young comedian, Jake, flashed Jim a nervous grin. "Wish me luck." "You don't need it," Jim said. "Just go be real." Jake nodded and hurried inside. Jim stood there for a moment, debating whether to follow. Instead, he turned and walked back into the city, the neon lights reflecting in his tired eyes. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to be funny anymore. The following morning, Jim Carrey woke up to a quiet room, sunlight filtering through the half-closed blinds. The echoes of last night's conversation with the young comedian still lingered in his mind. Pretend long enough until you forget you're pretending. Had that been the key to his entire career? Had he lost himself somewhere between the laughter and the expectation? Stretching, he forced himself out of bed and shuffled toward the kitchen, where he poured himself a cup of coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, but even the small comfort did little to lift the heavy feeling inside him. His phone buzzed on the counter, a message from his agent. "Big opportunity, Jim. Directors are dying to work with you. Let's talk today." He stared at the screen for a long moment before placing the phone down. The world was always waiting for the next joke, the next big role. But what if he didn't want to play that part anymore? Deciding to clear his head, Jim grabbed his jacket and left his home, stepping into the crisp morning air. He wandered through the city aimlessly, hands deep in his pockets, hood pulled low over his face. The streets bustled around him, people laughing, talking, moving. He had once thrived on this energy, fed off of it. Now it felt distant, like watching a movie on mute. His feet carried him to an old bookstore on a quiet street corner. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, greeted by the scent of aged paper and the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. He ran his fingers along the spines of the books, his mind elsewhere. "Can I help you find something?" a warm voice asked. Jim turned to see an elderly man behind the counter, his wise eyes studying him. "Just browsing," Jim replied, offering a small smile. The man nodded. "Funny thing about books. They hold pieces of people's souls, each page a fragment of who they were when they wrote it." Jim considered this. And what if you've spent your whole life being a character in someone else's story? The old man chuckled. "Then maybe it's time to start writing your own." Something about those words settled deep within Jim. He thanked the man, purchased a worn journal from the shelf, and left the store with a newfound sense of purpose. That night, he sat in his dimly lit living room, staring at the blank pages of the journal. Writing had never been his medium. His expressions were always loud, exaggerated, larger than life. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to let the quieter parts of himself speak. He picked up the pen and hesitantly began to write. Who am I when the cameras stop rolling? Jim sat at the small wooden desk in his dimly lit study, the open journal before him still tauntingly blank, except for the single sentence he had written the night before. Who am I when the cameras stop rolling? The question lingered in his mind like an echo in an empty theater. He twirled the pen between his fingers, staring at the words, searching for an answer that seemed just out of reach. He had spent decades being a character, on screen, in interviews, even in his personal life. He had given the world a mask of exaggerated expressions and boundless energy, but now, without a script or an audience, he felt uncomfortably exposed. A sigh escaped him as he closed the journal and leaned back in his chair. His eyes wandered to the bookshelves lining the walls, filled with literature he had collected over the years. Among them were books on philosophy, art, and spirituality, subjects that had called to him in recent years, but had always been pushed aside in favor of the next project, the next performance. Restlessness crept into his body, urging him to move, to escape his thoughts. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, drawn to the quiet hum of the nighttime city. Walking aimlessly, he found himself back at the small comedy club he had visited days before. The neon sign flickered overhead, casting a soft glow onto the sidewalk. Open mic night was in full swing. Curiosity got the best of him, and he slipped inside. The room was intimate, the air thick with the scent of beer and anticipation. A young comedian was on stage, delivering a joke about the absurdity of online dating. The audience chuckled politely, but Jim could see the nerves in the performer's posture, hear the uncertainty in his voice. Jim found a seat in the back, watching closely. He recognized that hunger, that desperate need for validation. It was the same fire that had driven him all those years ago. And yet, watching this young comic struggle to land a laugh, Jim felt something unexpected. Empathy, not nostalgia. After the set, the comedian stepped down, visibly deflated. Jim hesitated, then approached him. "Hey man, tough crowd tonight." The young man looked up, his eyes widening in recognition. "Jim Carrey?" "No way. What are you doing here?" Jim chuckled. "Looking for answers, I guess. You did good up there. Comedy's brutal, but you held your own." The comedian sighed. "I don't know. I thought I had a killer set, but they barely laughed. Maybe I'm not cut out for this." Jim placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Listen, I've been in this game a long time, and if there's one thing I know, it's that laughter isn't always instant. Sometimes people don't laugh because they're thinking, and sometimes you just have to be patient." The comedian nodded slowly. "Thanks, man. That actually helps." Jim smiled, then turned to leave. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, he realized something. He had spent his life chasing laughter, but maybe it was time to embrace the silence between the laughs. Because in that silence, maybe he'd finally hear his own voice. Jim sat in his living room, the journal open on his lap, its pages still largely blank. The weight of self-reflection was heavier than he had anticipated. He had spent his entire life crafting personas, slipping effortlessly into roles, but now, stripped of all pretense, he struggled to find his real voice. His thoughts wandered back to his childhood, the small-town boy with big dreams, the kid who made faces in the mirror, mimicking everything and everyone just to see if he could. That boy had been fearless, boundless in his creativity. When had that part of him faded? Was it buried beneath the expectations, the Hollywood machine, the constant need to be on? A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. He hesitated before answering. Standing outside was an old friend, David, one of the few people who had known him before the fame, before the larger-than-life persona had become his permanent mask. "Hey, Jim, you got a minute?" Jim nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They settled into the worn-out leather couches, a comfortable silence lingering between them. "Haven't seen you in a while," David said, studying him. "You okay?" Jim exhaled, rubbing his hands together. "Honestly, I don't know. Feels like I've been running so long I forgot where I was going." David smiled knowingly. "That's a hell of a realization." Jim leaned back. "I've been thinking a lot about when we were kids, before all of this, before I was Jim Carrey to the world." David chuckled. "Man, you were always Jim Carrey. You just didn't have an audience yet." Jim let the words sink in. Had he really changed? Or had the world's perception of him simply overshadowed the person he had always been? David pulled out his phone, scrolling through old photos. "Remember this? Our first comedy gig in that dingy little bar? We bombed so hard that night. But you, man, you didn't care. You got back up and made them laugh." Jim took the phone, staring at the grainy image of two young men, bright-eyed and unburdened. He laughed softly. "I was relentless. I missed that guy." David nodded. "He's still in there. Maybe you just need to stop looking for him in the spotlight." The words hit Jim harder than expected. Maybe he had been searching in the wrong places. Maybe the answers weren't in the next big role, the next big laugh. Maybe they were right here, in the quiet moments, in the echoes of the past, waiting for him to listen. For the first time in a long while, Jim didn't feel lost. He felt something else. Hope. Jim sat on the balcony of his home, overlooking the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The salty breeze brushed against his face, a reminder that the world continued to move, even when he felt stuck. The journal lay open on the small table beside him, pages now filled with thoughts, fears, and reflections. He had been writing every day, and with each entry, he felt a little lighter, as if shedding the weight of decades spent being someone else. His phone vibrated, breaking the serene moment. It was his agent. "Jim, we need to talk. I've got offers piling up. Studios are desperate for you. This is the comeback you've been waiting for." Jim exhaled slowly. The old him would have jumped at the opportunity, eager to entertain, to step into another character, to bask in the adoration of millions. But now he wasn't so sure. "I appreciate it," Jim said, his voice calm, "but I need some time." There was a pause on the other end. "Time? Jim, this is Hollywood. Time is money. If you wait too long, they'll move on." "Then maybe they should," Jim replied. "I think I need to figure out who I am before I play someone else." He hung up before his agent could argue, setting the phone down beside his journal. His heart raced, but for the first time in years, it wasn't out of anxiety. It was out of exhilaration. He had just done something that terrified him. He had chosen himself. The following day, he found himself back at the small comedy club. He had no plans to go on stage, no desire to be in the spotlight, but something about the raw, unfiltered nature of the place called to him. It reminded him of why he had fallen in love with comedy in the first place. Not for the fame, not for the money, but for the connection. A young woman took the stage, visibly nervous. Her hands shook as she gripped the microphone, clearing her throat. "So, ever feel like your life is just one long blooper reel?" she started, forcing a small laugh. The crowd chuckled lightly, and Jim smiled. He knew that feeling all too well. She continued her set, gaining confidence with each passing joke. By the time she finished, the audience erupted into applause. She stepped off stage, beaming, and Jim caught her eye as she passed by his table. "That was brave," he said sincerely. She laughed, still high on adrenaline. I figured, what's the worst that could happen? Jim nodded. Exactly. The fear is never as big as we think it is. As she moved on, Jim sat back, soaking in the energy of the room. Maybe he didn't need a stage or a script to make people laugh. Maybe his greatest performance yet was learning to just be himself. For the first time in a long while, Jim felt free. Jim woke up earlier than usual, the sunlight filtering through his window, casting a golden glow on the walls. For the first time in years, he felt excited about the day ahead, not because of a role, a performance, or a paycheck, but because of the unknown. The rigid script of his life had been discarded, and he was now improvising, embracing every unpredictable moment. He brewed a cup of coffee and stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the sun on his skin. The world seemed different, not because it had changed, but because he had. The once deafening silence of solitude had become a comforting presence, an invitation rather than a punishment. His phone buzzed. It was an old friend, Steve, a fellow comedian who had taken a different path in life, stepping away from the stage long before Jim had even considered it. Jim, I saw you at the club the other night, Steve said after a brief exchange of pleasantries. You looked at peace. It's been a long time since I've seen that in you. Jim chuckled, taking a sip of his coffee. Yeah, I guess I'm learning how to exist without needing to perform. Steve paused. That's huge, man. But tell me, do you miss it? The stage, the rush, the crowd? Jim thought for a moment. I used to think I needed it, but I think what I really needed was to feel like I mattered. Turns out I don't need an audience for that. Later that afternoon, Jim found himself walking through a local park, watching children play, couples sit together in comfortable silence, and strangers passing by with their own untold stories. He realized that life itself was the greatest performance of all, not for others, but for oneself. He approached a street musician playing an old guitar, his voice raspy but soulful. The man sang a song Jim vaguely recognized, something about chasing dreams and finding home. Without thinking, Jim sat down next to him and listened, nodding along to the melody. When the musician finished, Jim clapped genuinely, pulling out a few bills and dropping them into the man's open guitar case. Thanks, brother, the musician said, smiling. You got the look of someone who's been through it. Jim laughed. Yeah, you could say that. But you're still here, the man added, strumming idly. That means you figured something out. Jim nodded slowly. I think I'm still figuring it out, but for the first time, I'm okay with that. As he walked away, he felt lighter, as if the burden of expectation had finally begun to lift. He wasn't sure what was next, but for once, that didn't scare him. He was ready to embrace whatever came his way, knowing that the greatest stories were the ones lived, not just performed. Now at peace with himself, Jim realizes that his mission was never just to entertain, but to help people see the beauty of life, even in difficult times. He continues his career, but this time with